Episode 16, Fractured Pax, 160 to 169 AD. Welcome back to 202 decades. It's been a while. We and the new baby are doing well, and I'm excited to get new material out to you at last. If you are a frequent listener of the series, I want to let you know that you can support the show by joining the Patreon page. As a member there, you'll get access to exclusive episodes, a hub to discuss episodes and ask questions, and early access to new episodes. Thanks again for all of your support. If you look up the Pax Romana, you'll usually see an end date of 180 AD, a peace that stretched from the victory of Augustus in the Civil Wars all the way to the end of Marcus Aurelius' reign. I have to disagree. I think that you'll see a vast departure in this decade and next from the peace of the past 2 centuries. What we have here is a fractured peace. Sure, the reign of Marcus Aurelius is not the lowest point. Things will get worse. But war, plague, and invasion will end the Augustan tranquility. Last time, Antoninus continued to prepare Marcus for his succession. The junior emperor became more and more equal in power with Antoninus. A few revolts broke out, but they were easily quashed. In the golden sunset of the Pax Romana, we rested and took a look at the literature of the era and caught up with the Christians as they gradually step into the light of the historical record. I hope that break from action has left you rested. This decade, history picks up its pace. Here's what we're covering this time. Part 1, Shared Duties. Part 2, War. Part 3, Plague. Part 4, Invasion. Part 1, Shared Duties. Antoninus Pius had been growing feeble for the last several years. In March of 161 AD, at the age of 75, while at his family's estate a dozen miles from Rome, Antoninus took a turn for the worse. Struck by emesis and fever, he called his council to his bedside and turned the empire over to his adopted son, Marcus. Pius slipped into sleep and gave up the ghost. Befitting his reign, this was perhaps the calmest death yet for a Roman emperor. The succession was as smooth as ice. Marcus Aurelius' long training and increasing imperial duties over the last decade had prepared him well. The Senate was immediately ready to give him their rubber stamp of approval. It was a bittersweet moment for Marcus, who would have preferred to spend the rest of his life studying philosophy. He knew the monumental task of serving as emperor would be all-consuming. Perhaps it was this fear that led him to make his ascension to princeps conditional. He would become emperor, but only if the Senate also acclaimed the other adopted son of Antoninus, Lucius. This decision shocked the Senate and the public. While Marcus's reputation was pristine, Lucius had the reputation of being a bit of an unserious party boy. And of course, this broke all precedents. Sure, there had been power-sharing agreements before, like Augustus and Agrippa, Vespasian and Titus, and even Antoninus and Marcus. But in all of these cases, there was one official ruler and one unofficial or lesser helper. Never had there been 2 Augusti, 2 emperors ruling together. On paper at least, Marcus and Lucius were equals. They shared all offices jointly, with the exception of Pontifex Maximus, which Marcus held alone. However, it was immediately clear to anyone paying attention what the real dynamic was behind the scenes. Marcus was the one really in charge. We, like their contemporaries, have to ask, why did Marcus insist on sharing power with Lucius? A few things are clear. This had not been Antoninus' plan. Nor is it obvious that Hadrian had wanted this, as some have asserted. Hadrian required Antoninus to adopt Lucius and Marcus, but Marcus was the senior son. The idea to elevate Lucius seems to have come from Marcus's own head. The fragments of Cassius Dio's history confirms our suspicions. It claims Marcus elevated Lucius because he saw in Lucius a physical robustness which Marcus himself lacked. Marcus was frail of body, having devoted the greater part of his life to letters and philosophy. He tried to live the austere life of a Stoic philosopher in his youth, and this had taken a toll on his vigor. Lucius, though, was young, handsome, amiable, and frank. He was the kind of man who could lead the armies while Marcus stayed home and administered the empire. Between his philosophy lessons, of course. Or maybe Marcus saw that the empire demanded two rulers to run it effectively. Perhaps he sought to emulate the system of having two consuls at a time. All of this is conjecture, though. We don't exactly know why Marcus chose to share power. Perhaps there are factors we are totally ignorant of. Whatever the reason, it set a precedent, a, quote, bad precedent, according to the historian Will Durant. Marcus had erred through kindness in sharing power, and increasingly throughout the late empire, 2, 3, or even 4 emperors at a time became the norm. This division of power would eventually lead to a division of the Roman Empire itself. Marcus, upon his accession, took the name Imperator Caesar Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus, and Lucius took the name Imperator Caesar Lucius Aurelius Verus Augustus. I'll stick to just calling them Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. To cement their relationship, Marcus betrothed his 11-year-old daughter Lucilla to Lucius, though they wouldn't marry for 3 more years. Their first act as rulers was to ask the Senate for the deification of Antoninus. He was buried in Hadrian's mausoleum. In his honor, the temple of Faustina, Antoninus' late wife, was dedicated to Antoninus II. This temple is still pretty well preserved and stands in the middle of the north side of the Roman Forum. They followed the new emperor playbook to ensure support from all parties. They gave a big donative to the army, a bonus equivalent to 3 years' pay. Wouldn't you like to receive that? Marcus may have shared power with Lucius because he seemed like a natural leader for the army, but the truth was neither of them had any experience leading the armies. The enemies of Rome made note of that. The 2 emperors also made the customary visit to the Praetorian camp. I mentioned last time that Marcus had served as Praetorian prefect after the long term of Maximus, but I no longer think that's correct. My apologies. The 2 Praetorian prefects who did replace Maximus during the last few years of Antoninus' reign were Victorinus and Repentinus. The 2 emperors must have given the Praetorians a substantial cash bonus as well. And of course, they gave money to the people and hosted games. After securing their support, they got down to the business of ruling. They agreed on a splitting of duties between them, but it was immediately clear that Lucius was not up to the task. He was idle and dissolute. He neglected his duties, and Marcus was left to pick up after him. As a proper Stoic, Marcus bore these frustrations without a word of complaint. His reputation as a philosopher gave many in the senatorial class high expectations of the new emperor. They saw in him a fulfillment of Plato's philosopher king, the ideal ruler. Marcus himself kept his head out of the clouds, telling himself never to hope to realize Plato's republic. Instead, making himself content with small improvements in his subjects' lives. Despite his philosophy, he remained a realist. The new emperors had just begun to get accustomed to their meetings and correspondences when breathless riders from the imperial post brought news of disaster on the eastern border. Massacred legions, a Parthian invasion. The honeymoon period for Marcus and Lucius was snapped short. Now came the test of their abilities. Part 2. War. Over in Parthia, the king of kings Vologases IV received the news of Antoninus' death and put his long-laid plans into motion. Now, while the Romans were undergoing a succession, was the time to strike, while they were vulnerable. I gave a little background on Parthia last episode, but in short, Parthia had been divided in civil conflict since Trajan's conquests in the 110s. Since taking power, this Vologases had ended the divisions and consolidated Parthia under his sole rule. Continuing his momentum, he went south and conquered the city of Charax, which had been an independent port city on the Persian Gulf since 117 when Trajan had freed it from Parthian rule. With Antoninus dead, Vologases now looked north for expansion. Armenia was his next target. He had received reports that the new Roman emperors were not experienced military leaders, so he took his chance. Nothing had been able to stop his rise yet. In mid-161, a Parthian army under the general Chosroes marched into Armenia and removed the old king, who had been agreed upon by both Rome and Parthia. Vologases crowned Pacorus as the new king of Armenia. But Pacorus was merely a puppet. This Parthian grab of Armenia was a breach of the peace. War was coming. Word of the coup d'etat reached the Roman governor of Cappadocia. This was Severianus, an appointee of Antoninus left in place to smooth over the transition of power from Antoninus to Marcus and Lucius. As the governor of Cappadocia, the nearest province to Armenia, it was Severianus' duty to respond to the Parthian incursion. Like many others would have done, Severianus consulted with the gods before taking action. He sought out an oracle to guide his strategy. The god he inquired of was named Glykon. Glykon was a giant snake, some sources call him a python, who spoke through the conduit of a man named Alexander of Abonotychus. Lest you think this was a statue or an abstraction of a snake, no. This was a real, large snake that wrapped itself around Alexander's body. Alexander had gained a wide following in the East and provided oracles of all sorts, but especially regarding health to followers of his cult. See, Alexander claimed to have found the egg of Glykon under a new temple to the god of healing, Asclepius. If you've seen the image of a snake wrapped around a rod used in the medical profession, this is the rod of Asclepius. You can see the connection. Asclepius was the god of healing and had a snake as an icon. It wouldn't have been a stretch to imagine he was manifesting in the form of a large snake. So why all this talk of a snake prophet? Well, aside from how bizarre it is to imagine this Alexander traveling around with a snake on him at all times, or aside from how influential he became, even Marcus Aurelius later consulted the oracle on behalf of a campaign, his advice, or Glykon's oracle, shaped the future of Rome. Severianus, the governor of Cappadocia, was one of his followers. When he consulted Glykon before leaving for campaign, the prophecy foretold an easy victory for Severianus. So, Governor Severianus, with high spirits, gathered his legion and marched out to defeat the Parthians. They soon crossed the headwaters of the Euphrates, but he was reckless. As they approached the city of Elagaia, a Parthian army led by General Chosroes suddenly appeared. The Romans were taken completely off guard. Severianus and his legion were surrounded. Seeing the hopelessness of his situation, Severianus killed himself, and the legion was slaughtered to the last man. The Roman campaign had only lasted a few days. A harsh lesson not to trust the words of a snake. A ways to the south, the situation was a little better. Another Parthian army had advanced across the Euphrates River into Roman Syria. The governor of the province, Cornelianus, brought out his army to stop their advance. But at the first engagement, the Syrian legions proved undisciplined. They quickly fled as the Parthian arrows began to fly. At each point of contact, whether in Armenia or along the Euphrates, the Romans had proven unready. News from the east arrived in Rome at an unfortunate time. Not only were Marcus and Lucius still fitting into their new roles, but the city itself was suffering. Spring rain had brought floods on the Tiber. It had overflown its banks and swept into the low-lying portions of the city. Aside from the mud and the filth this brought, the flooding was causing a famine. Rome normally received nearly all of its food supply via the Tiber. The grain fleets which sailed the Mediterranean anchored and were unloaded at Portus on the coast. The grain was transferred onto barges, which could be pulled 18 miles up the Tiber River to the granaries of Rome. But with the floods of 161, the barges were not able to bring supplies upriver, and so the people began to starve. Marcus and Lucius were busy arranging shipments of food by other means when the news arrived of the fall of Armenia, the death of a Roman governor, and the failure of two armies to stand against the Parthians. There must have been tense meetings between the two emperors and their advisors. One of them would have to go east. A large response was needed, but entrusting any other man with a large army was an invitation for rebellion. It was decided that Lucius would go to Antioch and lead the Roman response. Officially, Marcus would stay behind because his hands were full in responding to the famine and flood. But subtler reasons are mentioned by our sources. The Historia Augusta, which loves to dwell on gossip, says that Lucius was sent east as an attempt to rein in his excesses with a little soldiering. And as we talked about in the last section, Marcus preferred Lucius go, rather than himself, because he saw in Lucius a more natural soldier and inspirer of men. Marcus rode with Lucius as far as Capua before returning to Rome. In the autumn of 162, Lucius and his entourage departed from Brundisium in the Adriatic and headed east. Lucius would have plenty of help. Marcus ensured Lucius was surrounded with the most capable generals of the age. Marcus Statius Priscus, who had been governor of Britain for only a few months, was chosen. Prior to his post in Britannia, Priscus had distinguished himself as governor of Dacia, in which he had some kind of military success. Whatever the details were, they were enough to display his skill as a commander. He replaced Severianus as governor of Cappadocia, and thus took command of the legions nearest to Armenia. Also heading east was Marcus Claudius Fronto. Yes, another Marcus. And he's not even the last. We're going to have to refer to each of the Marcuses by their last name, except for Marcus Aurelius. If you're paying close attention, though, you might be even more confused. Marcus and Lucius's tutor, who we talked about last episode, was also named Fronto. Marcus Cornelius Fronto, if you can believe it. Don't get Fronto the tutor mixed with Fronto the general. If you hear Fronto for the rest of the episode, I'm referring to the general. Anyway, this Fronto was in command of one of the Rhine legions stationed in modern Bonn, Germany. As Lucius set sail, Fronto and his men began the long march east. Traveling with Lucius by sea was a cohort of the Praetorians along with Victorianus, one of the two Praetorian prefects. There were many fighting men heading east at the time, rivers of soldiers converging on Antioch and Cappadocia. We already mentioned the legion under the command of Fronto, but two more full legions were sent east, one from the Danube and one stationed in Egypt. Many more soldiers than this were sent out, though. Of course, many auxiliary units moved east. But in a sign of shifting strategies, many vexellations, especially from Pannonia along the Danube, were sent east as well. These vexellations were detachments of a legion. More and more, since Hadrian, legions had become fixed garrisons rather than transitory fighting forces. More and more, the legions were synonymous with their base. So, rather than uprooting a whole legion, it was easier to send out a portion of the legion or several portions of several legions to the front. This kept the frontiers manned, but the reduction in soldiers wasn't missed by watchful eyes across the rivers. Lucius's journey to Antioch was long and meandering. After leaving Italy, he stopped for leisure in both Corinth and Athens. He was sightseeing, not rushing, maybe checking off a few sites from Pausanias's travelogue. They crossed the Aegean and stopped again at Ephesus. They lingered at the seaside luxury resorts nearby before finally reaching Antioch by early 163. At least on paper, Lucius got to work imposing discipline on the Syrian legions, punishing gambling and overdrinking, drilling them, and overall restoring them into a fighting force that wouldn't run at the first contact with the Parthians. If you've been paying attention to Lucius's character, though, you could probably gather that it wasn't him directly doing this, but the generals. To his credit, Lucius was a skilled delegator. Unlike some of the megalomaniacal rulers of the past, he was self-aware enough, or perhaps just distracted enough, to leave the important tasks to capable leaders. Like he had done on the voyage there, Lucius took to spending time in the gorgeous estates surrounding Antioch with a new muse, a beautiful Greek woman from Smyrna named Panthea. The Historia Augusta, in its biography of Lucius, gives more details, real or imagined, about Lucius's naughty exploits in and around Antioch than about the war itself. We're going to avoid doing the same. At about the same time Lucius arrived in Antioch, Priscus arrived in Cappadocia. Under his command were 2 legions, the 5th Macedonia, led by Marcus Verus, and the 1st Minervia, led by Fronto. Much more carefully than Severianus, and using logistics and scouting, the army of Priscus crossed into Armenia and headed straight for the capital. The army marched for 20 days, covering 300 miles before reaching the city. We don't have details on the resistance they faced, neither on the march nor at the city. Priscus's army put the city under siege, breached its defenses, and then razed it to the ground. The fate of Parthia's king of Armenia, Pacorus, is unknown. He may have been brought back as a captive to Rome. The old king of Armenia was reinstalled, and a new capital, closer to Roman territory, was founded, called Kaine Polis, or New City. Although Lucius had not taken part, let alone stepped foot in Armenia, he was granted the title Arminiacus for the victory. Lucius now sent out ambassadors to seek peace with Vologases. The Romans were massed on the Parthian border and had just retaken Armenia. To the Romans at least, it seemed like the perfect time for Vologases to hang up the towel. But you don't get to be the king of kings if you lack ambition. Vologases rejected the peace, sensing in it Roman weakness. The Parthians retook the initiative. With Priscus's army still consolidating Armenia, the Parthians captured the Roman client kingdom of Osroene, centered on Edessa, which is wedged between Syria and Armenia. They pushed on and crossed the Euphrates into Roman Syria. Avidius Cassius led the army sent out to stop them. He had spent the last few months whipping his soldiers into a disciplined fighting force, and it paid off. In a brutal battle at Sura, Cassius and his army got the better of the Parthians and drove them off. Before the campaign season of 163 came to an end, Cassius and his army captured a little territory on the far side of the Euphrates to use as a beachhead. As 163 turned to 164, both sides withdrew and prepared for their next move. The Romans had done well, but the war was far from over. 164 was a quiet year, a lull in the fighting. The generals drilled their armies, 2 new legions levied from Italy arrived, and Lucius kept up his extracurricular activities. 2 outings punctuated his leisure. First, he traveled to Ephesus, where he married Marcus's 14-year-old daughter, before quickly returning to Antioch to lounge with his real love, Panthea. Second, his generals and advisors convinced him to ride out to the Euphrates frontier to meet with the soldiers. It was deemed necessary for Lucius to make an appearance, but it was a brief outing. Lucius never saw fighting and never returned to the frontier. What were the Parthians doing in 164? Wish I could tell you, but we are sorely lacking in non-Roman perspectives. Cassius Dio hints that Vologases lost the support of his allies, or vassals, at this time. This may explain the quiet on the part of the Parthians in 164. In spring of 165, the Romans were ready to take the fight to Parthia. The army split into 2 columns and began moving in parallel down the Euphrates Valley. Marcus Verus led one column, Avidius Cassius led the other. Marcus Verus's army entered Osroene and retook Edessa. The Parthians fled to Nisibis. This too soon fell to the legions. Meanwhile, Cassius's army began pushing ahead, deeper into Mesopotamia. Outside the town of Dura Europos, the Parthian army met the army of Cassius in battle, and the Romans won a resounding victory. The way south was open. The army of Cassius constructed a bridge of boats and crossed the Euphrates. Unopposed, they marched through the heart of Mesopotamia until they came to a place where the Euphrates and the Tigris flowed close together. Here, between the rivers, was the metropolis of Seleucia. And just across the Tigris was the Parthian capital, Ctesiphon. Seleucia was a diverse city with a large Greek and Jewish population. It was a large and prosperous place. As the Romans approached the city's walls, the gates were thrown open, hoping to earn goodwill and prevent a siege or a brutal sacking. Well, they did manage to avoid a siege, but not a sacking. The Roman sources blame the locals for instigating violence as the Romans entered the city, but we can't know what really happened. Perhaps Cassius let his soldiers loot what they wanted, or maybe discipline broke down and the legions acted on their own. Either way, the Romans utterly sacked Seleucia for 2 weeks. Like maggots picking clean a corpse, its wealth was stripped. Untold thousands were killed. The city was destroyed and never recovered. The Romans moved on to their next victim, Ctesiphon, across the river. They captured the Parthian capital and managed not to destroy the entire city. The clearest sign of Roman conquest, aside from the smoldering ruins of Seleucia in the distance, was the destruction of the royal palace of the Parthians. Among the treasures looted from the city was an 18-foot-tall statue of Apollo. At this point, Lucius Verus declared victory and mission accomplished. Lucius accepted the title Parthicus to add to his honorific Arminiacus. You might feel that there was a lot of build-up to the fighting, and then the war really took off and ended in just a few minutes. This seems to be the case often in our ancient sources. I think it's probably due to our sources, 1, being more interested in biography than military movements, and 2, the writers of our sources being unfamiliar with the details of campaigns beyond the broad scopes, things they've heard about. They can say, Marcus Verus captured Edessa, Cassius built a bridge of boats and sacked Seleucia, and then took Ctesiphon. They can list the bullet points version of events, but not being generals or soldiers themselves, for the most part, limited their interest and their understanding of the more granular moments. Lucius headed back to Rome to celebrate a massive triumph, the first in living memory. It was a unique one, as he insisted Marcus share the honor with him. Traveling with Marcus in the parade were his 2 young sons, Marcus Annius Verus and Commodus. Both were acclaimed as Caesars, making them the official heirs to the empire. Notably absent from the parade were the generals who had actually led the fighting. As the treasures of Ctesiphon, including the statue of Apollo, made their way through the streets of Rome, Cassius was still deep in Parthia. Although a large number of his soldiers had returned to Antioch, a core remained for a final mission. Lucius, or his generals and advisors, decided to one-up Trajan's campaigns of 50 years earlier, and follow Alexander farther east. Cassius crossed the Tigris River and entered the region of Media, the core of Parthian territory. More of a raid than a conquest, this last phase of the war was successful enough that Lucius added Medicus to his long list of titles. But so far from Roman territory, Cassius and his men began to suffer from the long supply lines. They grew hungry, and many fell ill. They packed up and returned home. The war was over. Rome had won a resounding victory. That must have been what it felt like for Lucius and his generals. They had secured Roman dominance in Armenia, restored Osroene as a friendly client kingdom, thrice defeated the Parthians in battle, destroyed their wealthiest city, and burned down their royal palace. The outcomes were a miniature version of Trajan's dream. Now, a before and after map of the conflict wouldn't have shown a large gain of territory, but it did grant the Romans the cities of Dura Europus, Carrhae, and Nisibis, and it even gave them footholds across the Euphrates. Parthia was crushed for the moment. 30 years of peace followed in the east, and the Romans were lucky to have it. Although Rome won the war, its consequences were a large net negative for the empire. Of course, not standing up to Parthia may have brought a worse fate, but there was a devastating cost to Rome's victory. Let's start in the west. In the early 160s, the Caledonians of the Highlands of Scotland overran the Antonine Wall. The soldiers garrisoning the wall were killed or driven back to Hadrian's Wall. This kind of thing wasn't new. The guard had been driven back the last decade as well, before they regathered and retook the wall. But this time, the Antonine Wall was lost for good. Rather than diverting troops needed more in Parthia, Marcus allowed the wall to be abandoned. Aside from one brief foray back to the wall in a few decades, lowland Scotland and the wall of Antoninus Pius were gone from Roman control. The more formidable Hadrian's Wall once again became the limit of Rome's power. The second consequence of the war took a bit longer to manifest. To gather an army large enough to defeat the Parthians and conquer Mesopotamia, many detachments of soldiers and one whole legion was removed from the Danube frontier. On paper, there's only one fewer legion stationed along the river, but in reality, there had been a large reduction in the total number of soldiers there. Patrols were smaller and less frequent. Traders from across the river would have noticed emptier markets, maybe quieter streets. Word made its way back to the German tribes living north of the river. They began to plan, first alone and then together. And finally, there was Cassius. As Lucius left, Marcus made Cassius the new governor of Syria, giving him command of the east. Syria and the eastern provinces needed a unified and competent leader in case the Parthians broke the peace. His men were weary and sick. In fact, many of them had taken ill on the march back. Some only fell ill when they reached Antioch, others as they sailed back to their bases. Unbeknownst to Cassius, he had brought back not only spoils, but pestilence. His men were infected with a disease that would kill far more soldiers and civilians than the Parthians or the Germans. Part 3. Plague. How did it all start? You remember the emperors and their entourage riding past. Following them down the Via Sacra in parade were the glittering treasures of Seleucia and Ctesiphon. You remember feeling proud to be a Roman. The gods smiled on Rome. You watched eagerly as the legions marched past, looking for your cousin Marcus. It was hard to tell the soldiers apart, but finally you saw him on the far side of the street. "Marcus!" you yelled. Half a dozen soldiers turned their head. It was a popular name. But your cousin Marcus looked, smiled, and nodded in your direction before coughing and turning back forward. Your own smile had dropped from your face. The war had been hard on him. His eyes looked sunken and his face was covered in a rash. That should have been when you recognized the gods were not so pleased. But hindsight makes things clearer. After the triumph, that evening you and your family had dined with Marcus. It was clear he was unwell. He had a fever and left the supper early. The next day was normal. But the day after, you began to feel unwell yourself. It started with an intense fever. Then began the coughing. Your throat and mouth were inflamed and painful. At the same time, you were rocked by abdominal pain and diarrhea. Fatigue and extreme thirst soon followed. You could barely rise from bed. It wasn't just you. Your mother and sister were afflicted as well. A letter arrived from father saying he was unwell too. The messenger explained that nearly the whole city was sick and dying. Around day 9, a rash began to appear. On you and your sister, the rash was red and dry. But on your mother, the rash was pustular. On the 10th morning, you awoke to find she had died in the night. That was also the worst day for you and your sister. Slowly but steadily, though, you both began to recover from the plague. What you've just survived is the Antonine Plague. Like all ancient epidemiology, its origins are a bit obscure. It almost certainly came home with the Roman soldiers as they departed Parthia. It being picked up in the sack of Seleucia is a popular theory, but it could just as easily have come from Ctesiphon or another city. It seems the disease had its origins in China. It made its way to Parthia either by land on the Silk Road or by sea in the Indian Ocean trade. I keep saying it, but what was the cause of the illness? We can only make a hypothesis based on the symptoms described in the ancient sources. Fortunately, we have the most esteemed and prolific physician of antiquity at his peak during this period. His name was Galen, and he is an absolutely foundational figure in the history of medicine. His writing is so associated with this time that the plague is sometimes referred to as the Plague of Galen. A short detour before we circle back to the plague. Galen was born in Pergamum, a large city in the province of Asia, during the reign of Hadrian. His father, Nikon, was a mathematician and architect by trade, and he ensured his son had an elite education. Galen was prepared for a traditional career in the civil service until his father had a dream that the god Asclepius appeared and commanded his son to study medicine. Nikon listened to the vision. This message, at least, hadn't come from a snake's mouth. At the age of 16, Galen began to study in the Temple of Asclepius in Pergamum, which was famous for its healers. When his father Nikon died a few years later, Galen began to travel around the province of Asia to continue his study of medicine. Several philosophies of medicine existed in the Roman world, including that of the Pythagoreans and that of Hippocrates, still famous for the Hippocratic Oath. Galen eventually made his way to the prestigious medical school in Alexandria. Wherever he went, he excelled, synthesizing and refining his own philosophy of medicine. In 157, at the age of 28, he returned home to Pergamum and became the physician for the wealthy chief priest of the province, tending to the gladiators he hired. Under his care, the injured gladiators had significantly improved survival from injuries. 5 died under Galen's care, compared to 60 under his predecessor. Galen took his talents to Rome in 162. To avoid getting too off track, we won't get into all of his innovations, but among his most lasting contributions were an improved understanding of the circulatory system, treating illnesses based on diagnoses rather than auspices, omens, or divine signs, an encyclopedic gathering of pharmacological treatments, and a further development of the theory of the 4 humors which governed human health and emotion. He proposed that every part of the body had its own perfect purpose. We will have to come back to discuss Roman and medieval medicine at another time, but one clear downside of Galen's masterful work is that it closed the door on medical innovation for a millennia. Galen had found the perfect purpose of all parts of the body, so there was no need to question or innovate on perfection. Besides, no writer for centuries could match the sheer volume of work Galen produced, and that alone turned away challengers. Okay, with Galen introduced, we can finally see what he says about the plague, right? Well, unfortunately, he doesn't provide a super clear description of the disease, nothing systematic. He's more concerned with explaining treatment than with identification or diagnosis. Diagnosing this plague was probably obvious enough not to need clarification, but here and there we find a description. At that time, a young man broke out in ulcers all over his body on the 9th day, just as did almost all the others who were saved. On that day, there was also a slight cough. On the following day, immediately after he bathed, he coughed more violently and brought up with the cough what they call a scab. Galen's prescription for the young man was to travel south of Rome toward Naples and ingest a significant amount of the excellent local milk. This treatment could only come after the purging of the putrefaction of disease, however. He mentions that vomiting occurred in some, as did dark pustules. These were dry ulcers, and Galen describes the illness through the lens of his humoral medical view. What was left of the blood which had been putrefied during these fevers had, like a kind of ash, been forced through the skin by nature. And so we have our piecemeal description of the plague: enduring fever, pustular rash, swollen throat, coughing, vomiting, and diarrhea. Working from this ancient evidence, modern historians are left to debate what pathogen caused the disease. The majority opinion today is that smallpox is the culprit for the plague. Others have suggested an outbreak of measles. In either case, we are talking about an extremely transmissible disease. Although we blame the disease on a virus, the Romans looked to the gods. In particular, it seemed Apollo was punishing them with pestilence, as, if you recall from the Iliad, he was wont to do. The reason Apollo was angry with the Romans was mentioned in the last section. After the legions had sacked the city of Seleucia, they moved on to the Parthian capital of Ctesiphon. They were gentler here, except for the destruction of the royal palace. From Ctesiphon, a large statue of Apollo was removed and brought back to Rome as a spoil of war. Apollo was not pleased with this disrespectful relocation. In his anger, he had struck the Romans with the darts of disease. Another story claims the plague was released when a casket in Apollo's temple in Seleucia was being looted. If it was Apollo's curse, it had its intended effect. The Antonine Plague caused profound damage to the Roman Empire. Two modern schools of thought still debate the impact of the disease. Some propose the touch of the disease was relatively light, with no more than 5% of the population dying, if you can call 4 million deaths light. Another school of historians believes the disease absolutely ravaged the Roman Empire, with up to 25 to 30% of the population dying. As is usually true, the consensus and the truth is usually somewhere between these two extremes. 10 to 15% mortality seems to be a common and reasonable estimate. In an empire of 75 million, that means around 11 million deaths. If the modern United States suffered such similar mortality, we're talking about 45 million deaths. Think for a moment what kind of an impact death of every 7th person means for the economy, for the military, for society, and for psychology. Overstating the impacts of this epidemic isn't easy. Of course, not all the deaths happened at once, nor were they evenly spread. Our sources point to waves of disease hitting urban centers, and the cities were hit especially hard. The dense living quarters of the apartments in Rome lent themselves to the spread of disease. In the first outbreak in the capital, 2,000 were said to die each day. The other large cities in the empire, like Antioch, Alexandria, Carthage, and Lugdunum, were probably also hit just as hard. The mood in Rome was hysterical as the dead were carted away on carts and wagons. Thousands died, including many prominent persons. Priests performed special rituals to assuage the gods. This public panic also led to anti-Christian agitation. The Christian Justin, who we met last decade, was convicted and martyred on the orders of the prefect of the city during this time. While Rome and larger urban areas were hit hardest, other groups were spared the worst of Apollo's curse. Comparatively, the countryside would have been less affected. We can't know exact numbers, but it's also likely the German tribes beyond the Rhine and Danube frontiers were not hit so hard as the Romans. More of their settlements were small villages, and their largest towns were minuscule compared to Roman urbanism. In the last section, I mentioned that many whole legions and many detachments of soldiers had been pulled away from the northern frontier for the war with Parthia. The Germans had noticed these absences, and as we will see shortly in the next section, they will take advantage of the opportunity this provided. To make matters worse, the returning soldiers brought the plague with them to their legionary camps. These bases provided another opportunity for the disease to spread in close quarters. The legions were hit hard. The impact was probably worse than 12-ish% of the soldiers dying. First, even if an individual ultimately survived his illness, he would be incapacitated from his duties for 2 or more weeks. Second, the death toll of 10 to 15%, assuming that's accurate, is for society as a whole, not an individual. Considering that some escaped getting the disease at all, this means that of those who did get sick, mortality was probably higher than 15%. Looking at more modern strains of smallpox, up to 30% of those infected die. So, all that to reiterate, the legions were devastated. Marcus had to recruit soldiers from gladiators, slaves, and bandits to restore the legions to their full numbers. The Romans would need all the soldiers they could get their hands on. War with the Germans was about to begin. In this war, keep the toll of the plague in the back of your mind, killing as many or more Romans as did any barbarian sword or axe. Galen had fled Rome in 166. His fame had grown so large that he felt his presence in the capital would be too tempting for the emperors, and he would be called to focus his attention on them. He spent the next 2 years in his hometown of Pergamum. But in 168, even the distance between Rome and the province of Asia could not keep him out of the emperor's grasp. They requested his presence with them in Italy. Not in Rome, though. Marcus and Lucius were stationed at the northern Italian city of Aquileia, not far from present-day Venice. They were here to lead the armies in the war against the German coalition. Here, Galen is our witness to both war and the persistent effects of plague. He writes, "On my arrival in Aquileia, the plague attacked more destructively than ever before. So the emperors fled immediately to Rome with a small force of men. For the rest of us, survival became very difficult for a long time. Most indeed died, the effects of the plague being exacerbated by the fact that all of this was occurring in the middle of winter." 2 emperors left Galen and Aquileia in the winter of 168, but only one returned to Rome alive. Part 4. Invasion. Writing in the year 98, the Roman historian Tacitus, in his book Germania, wrote, "So long has Germany withstood the arms of Rome. During this long interval, many mutual wounds have been inflicted. Not the Samnite, the Carthaginian, Spain, Gaul, or Parthia have given more frequent alarms. For the liberty of the Germans is more vigorous than the monarchy of the Arsacidae, the Parthian dynasty. What has the East to boast against us but the slaughter of Crassus? But the Germans deprived the Roman people of 5 consular armies, and afterwards took from Augustus himself Varus with the 3 legions. Nor did a long list of Romans, including Drusus, Nero, and Germanicus, defeat them without loss. The mighty threats of Caligula terminated in ridicule. Then succeeded tranquillity, till seizing the occasion of our discords and civil wars, they forced the winter quarters of the legions, and even aimed at the possession of Gaul," a reference to the events surrounding the Batavi revolt in 69-71, "and again expelled thence. They have in later times been rather triumphed over than vanquished." This perspective on the danger of the Germans proved prophetic. The German tribes had been long feared, but rarely had they been a danger to Romans within the bounds of the empire. Beginning in the 160s, that all began to change. The danger came not from a single man uniting the German tribes and declaring war on Rome. Instead, there were processes, movements, migrations taking place hundreds of miles away in the murky lands of Central Europe and the Eurasian steppe, far beyond the edge of written history's vision. Migrations of nomads on the steppe caused a cascade of peoples which eventually lapped up on Roman shores. The tribes bordering Rome were under pressure. They were stuck between Rome on one side and desperate peoples pushing them from the northeast. This pressure forged the nearby tribes into a more united and dangerous threat. While separated into small tribes, the Germans were little danger to Rome. But over the course of the past 2 centuries, larger confederations began to form. This conglomeration can be traced back to 2 causes: pressure from these migrations and contact with the Romans. Faced with raiders and foreign tribes pushing into their lands, smaller groups of tribes banded together for mutual protection. The other side of the formation of confederacies came from contact with Rome. The wealth gained from trade with Rome, as well as a desire to imitate Roman organization, led to increasing hierarchies. This allowed greater organization into larger confederacies of tribes. For example, the Marcomanni, who lived in Bohemia, traded extensively with the Romans and had been more centralized than their neighbors since the days of Augustus. These two facts went together. With greater pressure and greater organization than ever before, the only ingredient missing was opportunity. Opportunity presented itself in the 160s with the relocation of soldiers to fight in the east and the ravages of the plague. Both made the border dangerously weak. In 166, the dam broke and the invasions began. Rushing across the Danube River into the province of Pannonia, modern Hungary, Austria, and Croatia, came 6,000 raiders from several tribes, but the Langobardi and the Obi are mentioned in Cassius Dio. This was not a small force, but local cavalry units and infantry units were able to link up and rout the invaders, driving the survivors back home. A successful response, but this was only the first trickle of the coming flood. To avoid reprisals from the Romans, 11 nations from beyond the Danube frontier came together to meet with the governor of Pannonia. Each of the nations was represented by a leader. Most noteworthy of this cohort was Balomar, the king of the Marcomanni. The barbarians and the Romans came to a truce. The terms were favorable to the 11 nations, but the Romans, just finishing the war with Parthia, were not in a position to make difficult demands. The German and Sarmatian tribes saw something in their negotiations that intrigued them. Perhaps the timid nature of the Roman diplomacy suggested weakness. Whatever the case, the Marcomanni and the Quadi, and probably the Chatti and the Iazyges, quickly broke the truce. The most noteworthy tribes engaged in this conflict were the Marcomanni, for whom the war is named, the Quadi, another German tribe, as well as the Iazyges, a Sarmatian tribe who I first mentioned in the 90s AD. It would be fascinating to have a source from their perspective. How did the tribes coordinate? Were they under central leadership? What was their end goal? It seems the Marcomanni and the Quadi demanded to be allowed to settle within Roman borders. Perhaps they sought a safer home from the pressure of more distant tribes encroaching on their lands. In 167, this large alliance of tribes burst across the Danube and broke into Dacia, Noricum, Pannonia, and Raetia. They seem to have numbered over 20,000, but they split into dozens of smaller raiding parties, only gathering together to defeat the Pannonian garrisons. They raided and looted and ravaged the lands they crossed. Pannonia was hit the worst. As usual, the exact chronology is confused, and what I present next might be slightly out of order. It seems Marcus tried to mount an immediate response, but with the ravages of plague, he could not gather an effective force. The German and Sarmatian tribes continued their devastation nearly unopposed. Many Romans were captured and hauled back across the Danube, with the aim of using their skilled labor to better the tribes. Raetia, Noricum, and Pannonia were on their own for the moment. Local legions would have done their best to stop the raiders or invaders and slow their destruction. For the moment, though, these provinces were overrun. The border on the Danube and the Rhine had always been the chief line of defense, but like a Cadbury egg, once you get past the hard outer layer, Rome's interior was soft and sweet. What these provinces share, apart from bordering the frontier, is their proximity to Italy. With no one stopping them, some of the raiding bands descended from the Alps and entered Italy itself. This was devastating to the Roman psyche. Not since Marius' day in the late Republic had an enemy entered Italy. It had been over 250 years. For the emperors, this barbarian rampage had escalated from a nuisance to a crisis of their own legitimacy. Italy had to be defended. And so, despite the toll of the plague, Marcus and Lucius scraped together an army and headed out from Rome to defend the home province. They paused in Aquileia, a large and important town at the head of the Adriatic Sea. Our sources are eager to gossip of Lucius and his preferences for the luxuries of the city rather than the difficulty of the legionary camp. Nevertheless, the emperor's army departed and moved north into Pannonia. This expedition was successful. Most of the invaders withdrew. The Romans managed to kill the king of the Quadi in the fighting, and the tribe asked Rome for help selecting a new king. Many of the raiders who now returned to their tribes were punished. Peace and order seemed near at hand. What to do next divided Marcus and Lucius. Lucius preferred to stay in Aquileia. Enough had been achieved. The invaders had been thrown back. But Marcus insisted on continuing with a proactive defense, and so the army stayed in the field in Pannonia. When the winter of 168 came, Marcus agreed to rest, and they wintered together with their army in Aquileia. A spring campaign was planned, but the plague intervened. Here's where we left off in the last section. Galen had been summoned to serve the emperors as their physician. He arrived in Aquileia that winter. In the last section, we heard him describe the horrible wave of disease that swept the legions stationed there. In January of 169, the outbreak became so bad that Marcus and Lucius and a retinue left the city and began heading back to Rome. But they had not left in time. Lucius had contracted the plague. He was soon sick, and within days of leaving, he suffered a seizure in his carriage and died on the road. My read on Lucius is that he wasn't a bad guy. He just wasn't emperor material. His successes in the East mostly came from not getting in the way of more competent men. That's actually a noble thing. He would have been a far worse emperor had he tried to bungle through sloppily leading the war himself. I'm left thinking about two counterfactuals, though. First, what if Marcus had never elevated Lucius as his equal? Would Marcus have led the war in Parthia personally? And how does that impact his future with the Marcomannic Wars? Second, what if Marcus had been the emperor who died of the plague in 169 instead of Lucius? Would that have avoided the civil wars that followed Marcus's successor? Or given Lucius's incompetence and inattention, would it only have accelerated the coming of internal conflict? We can debate these answers, but we can never know. What we can be sure of is that Marcus accompanied Lucius back to Rome for his funeral. He pressed the Senate and assured Lucius was deified. While in the capital, he arranged for the marriage of his daughter Lucilla, who had only just become a widow after the death of Lucius, to marry Tiberius Claudius Pompeianus. This new son-in-law of Marcus was a veteran general, and later in 169, as Marcus Aurelius headed back to the frontier, Pompeianus was by his side. They marched up through Italy, past Aquileia, and into Pannonia. The goal was to subdue the Iazyges, who lived between Dacia and the Danube River. We can surmise that they had continued to raid into Roman territory. The campaign of 169, though, was slow and inconclusive. Facing the same pressures which led to the initial invasions of 166 and 167, the barbarian tribes were wrangling for more action. With the Romans tied down fighting the Iazyges, their weakness was apparent. Other tribes began to join the fun. Late in 169, a Dacian tribe called the Costoboci, from beyond Roman control, burst across the Danube and rushed south through Moesia, heading for Greece. Ever since the Marcomannic Wars, there's been speculation that the invasions of these dozen or so tribes weren't spontaneous or independent. We hear rumors of coordinated attacks directed by Balomar, the king of the Marcomanni. At the same time as the barbarians rushed towards Greece, Balomar of the Marcomanni led out a huge army from Bohemia. They sidestepped the Roman army led by Marcus and moved south. The path to Italy was now open to the Marcomanni. That's where we'll end things this episode, with the imperial army still pulling out of battle with the Iazyges. trying to get back and stop the barbarian invasion. Next time, we will see the long conclusion of the Marcomannic Wars, examine the incentives of the war, and stick with Marcus through betrayal. Thanks for listening and for your patience since the last episode. Subscriptions or donations on Patreon help the show to grow and flourish. I'll see you next time.